All right, so you already know at this stage how to install or load a material onto a surface or a set of surfaces or a layer. So this part's kind of just recap, but go to layers. I loaded these for specific purposes. We talked a little bit last week about reflective surfaces being used on the ground plane in order to help activate that ground plane and make it a little bit more architectural in nature. So we're going to apply this semi-glossy one to the floor layer, but we're going to rename it first. So if you click it, and then you just click on the name, it'll highlight it just like any other file type convention that you're aware of. So we're going to call this floor. It's a very creative name. And then this one, it's actually called painted wall, which is pretty nice. We're going to just call this one wall. And then I picked the one that was a little bit more diffuse for the ceiling. So I'll call this one ceiling. Okay, and we'll talk about further materials for whatever you're going to have in the space later. So let's apply these. Let's go to your floor, and let's select objects. And then just go to the material, right-click it, and say Assign to Selected. Okay, and then when you go into Rhino and you unselect it, when you right-click and you say Select Assigned Objects, you can actually select all the objects that are assigned to that material in your model, which is quite nice, because sometimes you can actually assign materials just based off of what you have selected, like this one. If I right-click and I say Assign to Selected, it doesn't have to be layer-based. Okay, that's very important. All right. Obviously, we're going to take the walls layer, and let me deselect that. We're going to select all the objects on walls, right-click on wall, and say Assign to Selected. And then we're going to take ceilings, and this time I just want to kind of show you something a little funny that's a little different. That makes it a little bit easier on you, okay? So with Rhino, it has a line for materials. You can actually pull these materials over onto the layer in Rhino and assign that material to that layer. So if you add more ceiling surfaces, it automatically updates it with that surface. Okay, so I kind of walked you through the long, tedious way, and now we're going to kind of backtrack into the easier way, which is to say, rather than having to worry about selecting and assigning and all that stuff, I'm just going to take my walls, drop it on walls, floors, drop it on floors. Okay, that's how you assign materials. It's the best practice. Any questions about that? Okay, so one thing I do want to show you real quick. Well, let's start a test render, and then we'll do like a comparison test render with a couple of tweaks and stuff. So let's go to render, make sure my render is still set to Maxwell, good. The settings are assigned to your file, so in theory the settings that we played around with last time shouldn't have changed. So we have multi-light on intensity, that's good. Production quality, it's fine. Time limit 30, sampling level 15, that's fine. Let's go up to render and render. I'm just going to let this catch up a little bit while if it even gets there. There we go. There it is. Okay. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to get to that stage, like just a minute or so, and then I'm going to continue with some tweaks and stuff once you're all there. Yes?
How can you delete the one that you just drag it into the words?
It's a good question. I haven't done that in a while. Should just be like remove material. There you go. Boom. Remove material. Ceiling. Put it back on. Okay. Any other questions? That's a good question. Sometimes I forget about simple things like that. All right, I'll give you a minute to get caught up and start running your test render. Okay, while that runs in the background, we're going to do a quick tweak. And this is kind of neat what Maxwell does, because you can actually run renders and play around with things, sort of like alternates and stuff, and run them at the same time. Of course, you don't want to do too many My general rule of thumb is I try to keep it to less than 3 renders running at any time, and that's if they're like draft level, like not a super intense scene, not a lot of lights, just because it could really slow it down. So anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this material, and we're going to try and create one that's a little bit more glossy. Okay, so right-click the material. We're going to say clone material, and let's call this Glossy Floor. And then in order to modify that material, just double-click it. Okay. This panel is going to tempt you to play around with a lot of settings. Don't play around with a lot of settings. They're not very clear what they are because all they use are abbreviations and stuff. So if you really are passionate about it and you really want to get ahead of the curve, go ahead and look in the Maxwell guide. But ultimately, I want you guys to focus on just a couple of things. You'll notice that when you click on Glossy Floor, there's a couple of settings, but mostly this stuff right here just has to do with like the identity of the material. Okay, so it's like codified data that's built into the material that doesn't really change how the material looks, except for here in properties. You can change some things about like how deep the bump map is on the overall material, how you're dealing with shadows and reflections and stuff here. So we definitely don't want to change it to be on matte or dispersion, because we want it to be glossy and just kind of reflect light directly. So the real meat of it, though, is going to happen here in these layers. Okay, you have a folder, and that folder has layers within it, or I guess like more like property layers. But basically, this is a hierarchy, and it works just like layers that you would work in Photoshop, or, well, yeah, I guess Photoshop, really, because that's going to be what's on top, or Illustrator. So whatever's happening down here in this layer happens below what's up here in this layer. Okay, and so this is what I'm referring to here when I am telling you not to get too hung up on what's happening in all of this with all of these settings. There's a lot that goes on, like what is ND, what is ND, what is K, but I really want you guys to just focus on reflectance, and we'll kind of play around with like ND and K a little bit, and roughness. Okay, so those are the keys. Again, this is something that you want to touch very lightly if you change it. You don't want to get too crazy about it. But first and foremost, this material does have a little bit of color. So let's first change the color. The reflectance, it's funny because the material itself doesn't really have color. Like if you switch back up to the glossy floor layer, it says the material ID color is red, but it doesn't show as red. If you go to the basic layer, it has this kind of seafoam green or mint green kind of color. In order to change that, just, you guys know this stuff already. You know how to change colors. So just switch that to a gray. Okay. As soon as you do that, if you hit refresh, you'll notice that the material didn't really show up that different. That's gray. My colorization seems a little off on my, because of this. Because you're going to have that seafoam gray on both layers. So you need to change that a little bit. Now, why was that so significant? The reason that was so significant was because even though I changed this layer to a soft gray, the bottom layer was still that seafoamy green, but the way that these layers are built, the top layer is 20% it's kind of like transparency. I wouldn't necessarily call it transparency, but just think of it like it's a transparent layer. And the bottom layer influences it 80%. So if I were to change this to be white, you should see the reflection should get a little brighter. It was kind of hard to tell, but it did ever so slightly, especially up there. And then if this one gets a little darker, the overall material gets a little darker. Okay, so with floors, you generally want to try and keep them a little bit on the bright side, a little bit brighter than maybe their natural material, because light in digital environments doesn't bounce quite as well as natural light. So I'm actually going to switch this to be almost white, just a hair gray. And I will probably take this one and kind of darken it a little bit more so that the reflections are a little bit less pronounced, and you'll see why I did that when I get to the roughness part. So the roughness part on the 80% layer is 100%, and the roughness on the 20% layer is 25. If I decrease that to 0, you'll see that the reflection starts to get a little bit sharper. It is important to note that the diffusiveness of the material really is a relationship between those two. So if you have 0 and 100%, you're not really getting any diffuse light. Let's switch this to like 75. And you'll see that it becomes a little bit more like metallic, you know, so less so of a what am I trying to say? Have you guys ever seen like a garage that has a sealer on it, where the material is? I'll show you. I could just Google it. We have that tool. Yeah, so I'm trying to find a good example of what I mean. It's kind of like this floor, right? So this floor has, if you think of it this way, right, it has a roughness to the material itself. So the light is inherently a little bit diffuse. If I were to decrease the roughness of the 80% layer, it's going to start to look a little closer to this, where it gets a little bit sharper. Okay, and the light underneath doesn't really diffuse as much. This is a good example too. It's kind of like that. So anyway, you could even increase the roughness here and decrease the roughness more on the lower layer. And check out what that change looks like. So that makes it look kind of like a powder coated sort of material. Okay, so that's taking the roughness of the material from underneath the layer to be on top of the layer, which changes how that light diffuses across the surface. Does that make sense? Right? No? Kind of? Yeah. Do you guys know what sandblasting is?
Yeah.
Not a lot of you, I guess. So a sandblasted metal is going to have like this kind of, it's basically what you're seeing in the rendering right now. Like that looks like a sandblasted material. Okay, minus the speckliness of the rendering sampling level being really low. So anyway, I'm going to go back to my roughness being on the lower level, probably like 65, and I'm going to decrease the roughness on the top level to something like a 15. I think that should probably get us to what we want. Well, maybe this needs to be a little lower. I mean higher, sorry. And let's decrease this to 10. All right, so on the 20% layer I went to 10, and on the 80% layer I went to 80. That should be pretty good for us, I think, at this stage, because it looks like a concrete floor that's been sealed over that has some lights that are reflecting. Okay? Questions? It was a little long-winded, but you know, I want you guys to focus on the effect of what the thing does rather than all like the technical stuff, which I'm not really an expert in anyway, so it makes no sense for me to tell you that. All right. Up next, what I wanted us to do with that is apply a Glossy Floor to our floor layer and then run another render. So we're going to let this run for like, 3 to 5 minutes or something like that, and then we'll compare the two. And at this stage, because you don't want the other one to get too far ahead, you can stop this one. This one ran for 15 minutes, so it's going to be a little different, but. Oh, sorry, I left the video on. Oops.